So as we go through these slides, those of you who know me know today I'm going to keep it a little vanilla for you. I've used exosomes, and we're going to talk about exosomes as they play a role in regenerative medicine. I've used them in more different ways than probably anyone in the country, maybe anyone in the world. Today we're going to talk about musculoskeletal medicine, and it may aggravate some of you, and that's okay, because when I was sitting where you were, I was aggravated when I heard about 32 flavors of Baskin-Robbins ice cream, and I didn't know which one. The basis of the talk today is what to use in your regenerative applications. And as I go through different types of protocols for musculoskeletal, what you're going to learn is how stem cells work, why they work, when to use a scaffold, what can the scaffold add to the algorithm, and what are your possible outcomes. So maximize regenerative success, okay. So when you're first born, we take you back all the way when you're in utero. Your first totipotential, that means those cells can turn into anything. They can turn into placenta, they can turn into liver, into lung, into bone marrow, you name it. As you get a little further in utero, those cells can't form placenta anymore, and all of a sudden now they're pluripotential. By the time you're born, multipotential. Multipotential really only means that if I take those cells and I put them in a petri dish, that I can drive them down different cell lines. It doesn't mean that in your body, if I give you a mesenchymal stem cell with it allogeneic from someone else or autologous from your bone marrow or your fat, that those cells are going to engraft and become the tissues that you want them to be. The big take-home point of this slide is resident progenitor cells. And I'm going to show you some examples. But the only reason that stem cells and exosomes, and we'll talk about those, cause any growth is because everywhere in your body, you've got cells that are almost liver, cells that are almost lungs, cells that are almost cartilage. And those cells can be pushed to go down their own cell lineage. So there are benefits, and there are proponents, obviously, to both autologous cells and allogeneic cells. Autologous cells are from you, for you. We talk about bone marrow. Mesenchymal stem cells in your bone marrow, 1 out of every 10,000 cells when you're born is an MSC. And when you're about 80, it's about 1 in a million, roughly 1%. Everyone realize that that's playing with bone marrow? Your fat attrition rate is a little bit better. You lose about 10% of your mesenchymal stem cells every decade. So at 54, I got 40, 50% of what I was born with? But they're not the same stem cells that I was born with. As you get older, your stem cells will produce maybe a third of the messenger RNA, microRNA, and proteins that they produce when you're a newborn. Well, on the other flip side is allogeneic cells. And people have been talking about placental-derived cells, umbilical-derived cells. Those cells are potent, so potent that they can produce 3 times what you produce as you get older, like me. However, there are side effects. Your body may reject some of these cells. You can have an allergic reaction to the DMSO. If I put those cells in your circulation, within 8 to 12 hours, they're gone. Your immune system will pick them off because although they don't have MH2 markings, they do have MH1 markings. Arnold Kaplan, who's considered by many kind of the father of regenerative medicine, he used to think that stem cells were the building blocks for everything. And he's kind of recapitulated his whole view. As he's come into terms with the way we understand science now, he wants to call these all medicinal signaling cells because stem cells secrete paracrine secretions, little bubbles or vesicles or microvesicles or extracellular vesicles that trigger your own resident progenitor cells in your cartilage, in your bone, in your liver, in your lungs to continue down their own cell lineages. So what do we learn from science? This is not an odd picture for many of you. You've seen it before. It's called parabiosis or heterochronic coupling. You take an old rat, you take a young rat, you shave them down, you suture them together, and you let them run around. And then for their troubles in a couple of months, you euthanize them both. Now, the older rat will take on a younger phenotype over time. That's pretty cool. But nobody tells you about the bad fate of the young rat. Before he actually dies, he trends older phenotypically. So they're sharing something. So on the West Coast, they tend to jump ahead of all of us, and they find a way to make money on everything in Silicon Valley. So there's two groups. One is Wiscoré in Stanford, who started Alkahest, and that's to treat Alzheimer's. And then there's actually another group, Ambrosia, that recently shuttered its doors, and they would give you plasma from older people. Fountain of youth stuff, eh? All right. So it's important to realize you're not transfusing stem cells. Stem cells aren't simply just floating around your circulation, right? Unless you're giving somebody something to induce them to migrate out of the bone marrow, they're not floating around. So what are you giving them? This picture has been used everywhere, and it's terrific because it shows that stem cells are pericytes. And if you imagine the capillaries are really the roadway of everything, when they hug these capillaries, they secrete into them. And what they secrete into them, we're going to go over, and it's going to be the basis of our talks. What are the secretions? What are the paracrine secretions that make stem cells work? When you look about vesicles and microvesicles, good parents have good daughters. So if you have a cancer cell, that's going to secrete microvesicles and extracellular vesicles, but they're different. Mesenchymal stem cells, good parents, good daughters. When you talk about the secretions, there's two types you should be interested in. And these are global and artificial designations, but you kind of just have to follow me with that. If it comes from endosomal budding, those little vesicles are 40 to 100 nanometers, really, really tiny little bubbles. And they contain the plasma membranes of the internal plasma because it comes from budding of multivesicular bodies from the internal endosomes. If they're a little larger vesicle, maybe 100 or 200 nanometers, now it'll bud out from the external plasma membrane. What's important, actually, is that these vesicles, as they come from their parent cells, contain the integrin and tetraspanin proteins of the mom and dad cell. And that's cool, because if you were to wash those proteins off, cells won't pick those up. And in fact, if you integrate mesenchymal stem cells into your vascular system, within the exosomes from them, within 6 hours, they will be picked up by macrophages almost everywhere. They'll go to your alveolar macrophages, they'll go to Kupffer cells of your liver, and they'll end up in your spleen because that's where macrophages migrate. If you were to wash those little proteins off, they don't get picked up as well. And one of the reasons that we encapsulate these things is if you just put proteins into your venous system, proteinases will eat those up. The little plasma membranes are actually delivery methods for all of these paracrine secretions. What is internal? Part of the problem is when we look at assays, we tend to look at proteins. Proteins are short-lived. Anyone ever wonder why you get PRP injections every couple of weeks? Because the proteins get metabolized. If you have micro and messenger RNA, you're actually giving protein factories that'll get picked up by your cells, and a messenger RNA that gets transferred can actually kick out thousands of proteins each. So these are all components of these little vesicles. So what are some key advantages? If you're not dealing with cells and you're dealing with vesicles, all of these key advantages are very important. You can deliver them anywhere. They can certainly cross over. They're anywhere from 1/100th to 1/1000th the size of a cell. They don't contain DNA if they're from mesenchymal stem cells. If they're from cancer cells, it's a different animal. They can home because they have those little proteins, and they have micro and messenger RNA that is a big difference from everything you've been dealing with protein-wise. There's no first-pass lung effect, although they will get picked up by the alveolar macrophages. They won't transdifferentiate. They won't cause cancer. There is no DNA. This is a very important slide, and if you're to look at one, I want you to focus on this. Mesenchymal stem cells do two very important tasks, and this is the basis of why we use it in joints and everything else that I do. They're pro-growth and anti-inflammatory, and I've heard all the bad press. Oh, they're empty missiles. No. They are basically the first conductor in the orchestra. Your resident progenitor cells will continue the music. This is to kick the system on. So when I say influences growth of target cells, prevents apoptosis, cell death, influencing phenotype. So exosomes have TGF-beta 3. That's the most potent way to shift an M1 to an M2 macrophage and a T helper cell to a Treg cell. That is a potent way to downregulate or immunomodulate your system. Cell fate, they can prevent cells from dying. They promote regeneration. They're immunomodulatory, anti-fibrotic, and anti-inflammatory. Here's the keys. When I started going to these conferences, and I've been going to pain conferences for years, one of the biggest problems I had, I would come into a hall like this, and I would hear 20 different talks. And everyone wanted me to use umbilical cord stem cells for the knee, but when you use the cartilage, then you need this, and it just got crazy to me. And the science didn't substantiate what I was being taught, and I had a major problem with that. So what I'm going to do for you, I'm going to break it down based on the assays and let you make your own decisions. There are some great components of amnio, and I'm going to show you on a combined slide back and forth how that differs from exosomes. And remember, exosomes are the workhorse of stem cells. We're going to talk about scaffolds. And I've become somewhat ambivalent as to what scaffold you use. I like platelet-rich fibrin matrix because it's easy to work with. Some people love PRP. Some people are married to hyaluronic acid. If you get a good deal on that, that's certainly a good scaffold. And then we're going to talk about some combinations. So let's go have at it. This is a really important slide. In the first row, now these are protein assays. Exosomes versus amnio, and then some of you are going to be introduced to room temperature amnio. If you get amnio at room temperature, you know what it's good for? Another piece in your garbage. Because if it's not frozen, those proteins don't stay alive. So let's go down some of these key points. BDNF, which is important for growth factors of nerves, is in the amnio. And when you look at some of the BMPs, some of the ones are higher in exosomes. One of the BMPs, BMP4, is important for dendritic growth. And that's kind of important because I use exosomes for a lot of neurological conditions. And I'm going to show you some other stuff that it has in it. Let's look at some of the other BMP7. Important to turn mesenchymal stem cells into bone and cartilage. So just as BMP7, I think, is important for bad OA, there's also TGF-beta 1 in amnio. One of the reasons that if you have bad OA, I don't like just to give you exosomes. I want to give you amnio too, so you can start forming cartilage. If you look up at GDNF, glial-derived neurotrophic factor, is important for neurons. Again, that is more prevalent in exosomes. Growth hormone, more prevalent in exosomes, and that's how you're going to grow these tissues. Here's a slide that's misleading at the very top. IGF-BP, so IGF-1, right, growth hormone goes to the liver kicks out IGF-1, and IGF-1 circulates and makes all the changes. And years ago, all the muscle heads used to try to take, anyone remember the muscle guys taking IGF-1? It didn't work because IGF-1's got about a 10-minute half-life. But if I gave you IGF-1 and it doesn't work, maybe it would play differently if I gave you IGF-1 binding protein. And although you see the levels in the exosomes are not very high, I'll show you on another slide that the messenger RNA that codes for those is quite high. So it may be that the assay is not completely catching all the proteins. Then you go to insulin. There's actually some insulin protein in exosomes. Again, some of the neurotrophins seen more in exosomes, and osteoproteaginine is seen in exosomes in very high levels, and that inhibits osteoclasts, because we're going to talk about that, about blasts and clasts in a few minutes. I actually give these to people who have osteopenia and osteoporosis. Platelet-derived growth factor, very high in amnio, looks a little bit like PRP,